Thanks for joining and welcome to The Objective Hindu. Today I'm going to start a video series on the Israel-Palestine question, a three-part series. In the first video we'll look at the theological and historical context. The second one will focus on the legal and political backdrop. And the third one will kind of address the moral question in terms of who's wrong and who's right. But let's start today by understanding why this region is as important as it is to the people who live there, as well as some who haven't lived there but claim to have some sort of skin in the game. So when I talk about Palestine, especially in this first video, I mean Eastern Palestine, which is now called Jordan, Israel as the modern state exists, as well as the Palestinian territories of West Bank and Gaza. Now, this is one of the oldest settled regions on earth, and its history goes back to at least 3000 BC. It gets its name from an ancient seafaring people who were called the Philistines. And the Philistines are believed to have settled along the coast of Palestine. They're believed to have come from the Greek Isles, from across the Aegean Sea. They were displaced by the Canaanites, who are referenced in the Hebrew texts. And the Canaanites were displaced by the Israelites, which is where the Jewish story starts. But this region has been home to many people, Semitic and non-Semitic, including the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Romans, the Ottomans, etc. It's probably worth understanding who the Semitic people are. The Semitic people are essentially those who speak the Semitic languages, such as Arabic or Hebrew or Akkadian in the old worlds. And what's worth understanding in the context of today's video is the Jews and the Arabs are both Semitic people, versus, let's say, the Turks or the Persians who are not Semitic. So this particular region, with its very diverse history and it was a little bit of a melting pot of people and cultures, has a little bit of a secular character to it, because it was impossible to rule this particular region, if you were the ruler, without having some sort of system where you could accommodate the different people who lived there, because it was never a homogeneous sort of civilization or population that you were dealing with. It was quite diverse. In fact, the Pact of Omar, which is he was, I think, one of the earliest caliphs of Islam, I think the third or something. So he signed a pact with the rulers of Jerusalem when he took over, when the Rashiduns came into power in Arabia and brought Islam and took over and captured this region of Palestine. He actually signed a pact which actually allowed and outlined the conditions under which the non-Muslims, particularly the Jews and the Christians, could continue living in Jerusalem. So again, while by modern standards you wouldn't really consider that pact to be a pact, but in those days it was some kind of an effort or an attempt on the part of, in this case, Omar, to govern the region in a reasonably sort of secular manner, as secular as those times allowed it to be. Both the Jews and the Muslims have theological connections with this land. We'll talk about the Muslims first. So the Muslims believe that Prophet Muhammad ascended to the heavens from Jerusalem, specifically from a mosque there called, not from the mosque, but from the spot where now there is a mosque called the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is considered the third holiest mosque in Islam. And because Islam is, of course, a continuation of the Abrahamic story that started with the Jews and the Christians, there is all sorts of connection with the Holy Land. Obviously, lots of pre-Islamic prophets like Abraham, Solomon, David, etc., Moses are believed to have either lived or born on, or at least lived in this region. The Muslims have that sort of connection of that being a blessed land. In fact, the Muslims prayed facing Jerusalem during the early years of Islam, before the direction was then revised and Makkah became the new sort of spiritual center. So the Muslims have a fairly deep connection in history, but the Jewish connection, I would say, is even longer and stronger. So let's think about that for a second. Now, the Jews believe that they're the descendants of Abraham, who there were 12 tribes apparently back in the day, and these are the descendants of Abraham. And the Israelites were promised this particular land by Abraham, and so their stories go back to, I think, around 2500 BC or so, and 2500 years ago, so around 500 BC, which is when they believe that Moses, who led them when they were exiled from Egypt, brought them to this area and defeated the Canaanites, who were the existing people living there, and established the kingdom of Israel. So there's that connection there. Then of course there's a messianic sort of side to the Jewish story, because the Jews believe that their Messiah, who's yet to appear, will one day appear and restore the kingdom of God, aka Israel, where peace, justice, and tranquility will prevail. If you're a Hindu and you are watching this video, think of this as the equivalent of some kind of Ram Rajya. And you might have also noticed the connection between some Hindus claiming to be descendants of Ram or Krishna, and the Jews claiming to be descendants of Abraham. And of course, the higher you go in the prophetic lineage, the more special you become. So that's because they have a very old claim, so to say. I'm not saying it's necessarily true, but this is what the claim is. All right, so let's see. So you've got this, and then of course the Jews have a lot of theological connections there. They had their old temples there. The first of which was destroyed by the Babylonians. The second was destroyed by the Romans. In fact, there is the west wall of the second temple still remains, and you might have seen videos and pictures of Jews even today, essentially putting their palms on that wall and praying and crying, and sometimes becoming very emotional. And again, their messianic belief is that when the kingdom of Israel will be restored, the temple shall also be rebuilt. So there's a long sort of historical connection. And at no point during the history of the last 2,500 years have Jews not lived in this region. There has always been some Jewish presence from around 500 BC. Even though Jews have traveled and been exiled and lived in all different parts of the world, there have always been some Jewish presence in this particular region. So it goes back a long time. Now, in the 7th century, of course, the Muslims came into the picture, and the Rashiduns, like I already alluded to, Umar, the Pact of Umar, they took over, and that legacy then continued with many other dynasties, Islamic dynasties. The Rashiduns, the Abbasids, the Fatimids, the Ayyubids of Salahuddin fame, and the Ottomans, of course, the final caliphates. So there's been, of course, a long tradition of Islamic rule, if you want to call it that, in the last 1,500 years. That includes most of Palestine and its sort of neighboring regions. Now, what I want to talk about is so hopefully that gives you a good picture of the sort of the Jewish and the Islamic and the Muslim connection to the land. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think both of what I've said are true. The Jewish connection is probably a little deeper and older, but again, I'm not necessarily stressing therefore they're right and others are wrong. That's not the point of the video. But let me talk about a few things that are not very commonly understood, or most people are not aware of these, because we today tend to believe that the Jews and the Muslims have been at it since eternity. That's not true. Let me give you some real insightful evidence about this. So when the Crusades happened, so remember the Crusades were Catholic Church sponsored cleansing events where the Christians believed that they needed to recapture the Holy Lands. Now, recapture from whom? They actually wanted to recapture them from both the Jews and the Muslims, not just from the Muslims. It just so happened that during the Crusades, for a long time, the Muslims were in power, including when the Crusaders were defeated by Salahuddin. But as far as the hostilities are concerned, the Christians from Europe were truly anti-Semitic. And remember, the Jews and Arabs are both Semites, which means they actually dislike them. I'm putting this very mildly, but they dislike both of them pretty much equally. The Jews were also subject to the same brutality, killings, persecution, conversions, etc., for all sorts of religious reasons. If you're interested, for example, back in the day, the Christians considered the Jews to be Christ killers, and there were charges of blood libels, etc., levied at the Jews. So when it came to fighting the Crusaders, the Muslims took the lead, and that's because they had better political power and military organization. But both the Jews and the Muslims were on the same side in terms of being the persecuted. And this is very counterintuitive, because we think about the modern world today and you think about Israel, which is an ally of, let's just say the Western Christian world, if you want to put it that way. And you feel that that's sort of an alliance made in heaven, but really that's not true. It's only in the last 100 years that the Christians and Jews have normalized relations. And I'm not going to say that, of course, the Muslims and the Jews were always, brothers in arms, but they have lived relatively peacefully for large periods of time in history. Similarly, the Jews have been expelled from all parts of Europe, from Spain, from Portugal, from Italy, from parts of the Protestant parts of Europe. These are all obviously Catholic countries, but even from Britain, and then certainly from the eastern parts of Europe and under the Russian domain, right from the 12th century. And Jews were not given rights of citizenship. They had to live separately. They could not own land, etc., in Christian countries. I'm not talking about Muslim lands here. And guess where a lot of Jews emigrated when they could, especially in the 17th, 18th centuries when the Ottomans were in power. So remember, they were being persecuted in Russia, Poland, Lithuania, etc. This is before the Holocaust and the whole German story started. But guess where all of them ran? They actually ran to the Islamic Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And not just did they go there, they were actually welcomed there. Again, when I say welcome, remember I'm using words in the context of the 17th century, not the 21st century. So as welcome as you could be in the 17th century, I guess. There are official declarations by the Ottoman sultans inviting the Jews to come and settle on Ottoman territories. So Salonika, which is in Greece today, Istanbul itself, Haifa, Jaffa, Jerusalem, Baghdad, and Damascus, which were all important cities and trading centers in the Ottoman reign, had large Jewish settlements that were actively encouraged by the Ottomans. And these were Jews who were running away from Christian land. So again, this is pretty counterintuitive to a lot of people today, because you'd assume that they would be happier in Christian lands and be persecuted in Muslim lands, so to say, but that was not true. The Ottomans also gave them, while they had restrictions on all non-Muslims, but the Ottomans had a very sophisticated political system which allowed the Jews to have certain rights, including the right to buy land and till the soil and participate in financial activities, etc. So that's something, I just wanted to set this context both from a Crusades perspective as well as much later, that while the idea today that the Christians and the Jews somehow appear to be joined at the hip, this is not necessarily been true. And I dare say that it's only like 100 years or so now, not even 100 years, that sort of bonhomie has really taken shape. And similarly on the other side, it's only been less than 100 years that the sort of intense dislike or hatred that we see between Muslims and Jews has also taken shape as a consequence. Now, I talked about the fact that the Jews were moving to the Ottoman lands, including Palestine, which was ruled by the Ottomans, for a number of reasons. This was massively accelerated, of course, after World War II or during World War II, when the Holocaust was happening, and so far more Jews then moved there. And we'll talk about this briefly in the second video. So while Zionism, which is this Jewish nationalist ideology, again we'll talk about this separately, wasn't the main cause, religious security and economic opportunities were the main reasons why the Jews had started moving outside Europe and moved in great numbers to many Ottoman cities, including Jerusalem and Haifa. So I'm often asked, who lived there first, Avi? Who's got the best claim? And hopefully the context that I provided will answer this question, and the answer, unfortunately, is that it's impossible to answer it in terms of A versus B. Both communities have a long sort of historical connection, and both people are the native people. There are native Palestinian Arabs and there are native Palestinian Jews, and both of them have lived there for millennia, including before their respective religions came into the picture. At least in the case of the Muslims, that's true. With the Jews, they kind of believe that they were settled there. So at some stage, there's a sort of a finite start date, I guess. But both of them, both the Semitic people of that region, at least the ones who have survived, are indigenous to that region, and hopefully the context that I provided in terms of the relationship between the Jews and the Christians, which was far from cordial for the most part of history, as well as the relationship between the Jews and the Muslims, which was far more cordial, at least for the most part of history, also gives you some additional perspective on why this is such a hard question to answer. I will though say that from an ethno-cultural perspective, I guess the sort of Judeo-Jewish relationship to that particular region is very deeply entrenched. Do I think that that is, the right justification for the creation of a state or the expulsion of different people who reside there? Absolutely not, and we'll talk about that in video 2. But I don't think I don't think there's a problem in sort of admitting and understanding the extent to which the Jewish people have a historical, emotional, and ethnic sort of connection with this particular region. Now, Zionism, which is this political ideology, which we'll talk about in the second video, and the creation of the state of Israel, based on support from the British first and then the Americans of late, needs to be understood in a very different context. And before that's exactly why I wanted to give you the historical context before talking about how these nations came into existence. But I'll leave you with this thought that the Zionist sort of movement, which really is an ethno-nationalistic movement that sought to unify the Jews and gave it a political identity, especially the European Jews. The Palestinian Jews were actually not part of the Zionist movement, funnily, but the European Jews were. That movement was supported by the British, and therefore eventually the State of Israel came into existence, for reasons that again are not very well understood by most people. It had nothing to do with their support of the Jewish cause or the Jewish people. It was entirely circumstantial and opportunistic, and based on World War I and the sort of strategic interest that the British had, and the visions that they had for a post-World War I sort of empire that they already had in place. We'll talk about all this in the next video, but hopefully this first part has given you some food for thought and some insights that perhaps you were not aware of, and then set the context for the next step, which is very much the sort of understanding of what happened in terms of Zionism. How did these people, the Jews of Europe, settle there? What was the role the British played? What was the role the Arabs played, the French played? And how the modern states of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan came into existence. We'll look at all this and more next time. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed the video, please do feel free to share it and comment, ask me any questions, and I'll try and answer them to the best of my abilities.